I'm the kind of guy who can erase all traces of my existence. I've made a career out of it. A quiet, deadly killer hired to take care of the target without ever being seen. It's supposed to be simple, in and out, silent, clean. But of course my luck had other plans. I moved into this apartment perfect for my mission. Hidden in plain sight, far from suspicion. But there's one problem. The place has the worst soundproofing I've ever encountered. I can hear everything. The creaky floors, the thin walls, every conversation that drifts from the apartments around me. It's like living in a fishbowl. My job was simple. Monitor the target, stay under the radar, and wait for further orders. All I wanted was to do my job without any distractions. But nothing is ever that easy. The neighbors are too noisy, the walls are too thin. And then there's her Ha-eun, the friendly, over-curious woman next door who's way too interested in my quiet, unremarkable life. I just want to finish this mission, and disappear. But things never go the way I want. Story begins. Don't forget to check out our YouTube channel. Like, share, and subscribe to join our channel's journey. Chapter 1. The Move-In. I've always prided myself on precision and stealth. It's not just a skill, it's a way of life. In my line of work, there's no room for error, no second chances. As one of the most sought-after assassins in the underground world, I've carried out countless missions with no trace left behind. Every movement, every decision is calculated. Every risk is accounted for. But this job, it was different. Rather than the usual quick hit and run that was my trademark, this assignment called for patience. The target wasn't some fleeting figure that could be taken out in a single, clean strike. No. This time, my role was to infiltrate a residential complex, observe the target, and wait for the green light. Simple enough. Right, at least that's what I thought. The apartment complex I moved into wasn't much to look at. Modest would be a generous description. The building had a tired look to its thin walls, creaky floors, and the faint smell of musty air that never quite went away. It was the kind of place where people were constantly bumping into each other, where privacy was more of a concept than a reality. Everyone knew everyone else's business. It was ideal for blending in. A quiet, unassuming guy in a rundown building would never attract attention. But even in a place like this, there were challenges. The noise was one of them. As I unpacked my sparse belongings, nothing fancy, just the essentials, I tried to ignore the constant creak of the floors above and below me. I had grown used to the sounds of city life. But this was different. The walls were paper thin, and it wasn't long before I began to realize that I was no longer in control of my own environment. The conversations I once expected to be muffled were now loud and clear. I could hear every word, every movement. I could hear the neighbors like they were sitting right next to me. "Mom, where's my charger?" a young voice shouted from next door. It was a boy, probably no older than 10. "I told you to keep it in one place. Look in your room," his mother yelled back, her voice rising in frustration. I pinched the bridge of my nose and let out a deep sigh, the sound of their bickering cutting through my concentration. This wasn't ideal. I had become accustomed to silence, my mind always functioning best when there were no distractions. But here in this place, it seemed privacy was a luxury no one could afford. I glanced around the apartment, a space that felt more temporary than permanent, as if it were a place I could only occupy for a short while before moving on to the next mission. The furniture was sparse, nothing more than a couch, a table, and a chair. It was a place meant for function, not comfort. My eyes settled on the window, and I pulled the blinds slightly to one side. From here, I had a perfect view of the apartment directly across from me. My target's apartment? I didn't have a lot of time to waste, so I focused on the task at hand. Blending in. I could already tell it wasn't going to be as easy as I had hoped. The walls seemed to be alive with sound, and it didn't help that the building had that disjointed, almost claustrophobic feel to it. The tenants were loud, the hallways narrow, and even the floors beneath me seemed to complain with every step. The noise didn't stop. "Mom, the Wi-Fi's down again?" For a moment, I almost considered moving somewhere quieter. But then, just as quickly, I reminded myself that I couldn't afford to be distracted. I had a job to do, and this was the place that would make it happen. I leaned back against the wall, exhaling deeply as I adjusted the knife hidden beneath my coat. The weight of it was a small comfort, a reminder of my purpose. The boy's voice carried again, distant but still clear. "I'm gonna play games anyway." I set the box I had been unpacking down, and ran a hand through my hair, my mind already moving to the next phase of the plan. The target was near. My job was to watch, wait, and strike when the time was right. Patience was key, but that didn't mean I had to like the situation. This building, with its lack of privacy and constant noise, would be a challenge, but it wasn't the worst I'd encountered. I could make it work. I turned away from the window, my eyes scanning the room. There was something else. I had to deal with the neighbors. There was the boy and his mother, of course, but there were others too. People who would inevitably get in the way. My next-door neighbors, for instance, were bound to be a problem. Just then, I heard a knock at the door. I froze, my heart rate picking up. I didn't expect anyone. Not yet. Another knock, louder this time. I took a cautious step toward the door, my fingers tightening around the handle. It was probably just someone checking in to say hello. Maybe it was the landlord? Or maybe it was the kind of friendly neighbor who would try to insert themselves into your life when all you wanted was isolation. I took a deep breath, my fingers relaxing around the handle. Whoever it was would just have to wait. I wasn't ready to engage with anyone yet. Another knock, followed by a voice. Hey, are you home? The voice was too cheerful, too familiar. It wasn't the landlord? It was someone else. Someone eager to make an introduction. I exhaled sharply. This wasn't ideal, but I could manage. I opened the door a crack, just enough to see the woman standing on the other side. She was smiling, holding out a plate of something that smelled like fresh cookies. Hi, she said brightly. I'm your neighbor Ha-eun. I thought I'd welcome you to the building with a little treat. Everyone could use some cookies, right? I didn't know whether to smile or to close the door in her face. Instead, I simply nodded, accepting the plate without a word. I wasn't here to make friends. Thanks, I muttered, then shut the door quickly. As I leaned back against it, I couldn't shake the feeling that the people around me might be the least of my problems. In a place this small, privacy was going to be the hardest thing to maintain. Still, I couldn't afford to dwell on it. I had a mission to complete. The target was close, and soon, I would make my move. Until then, I would need to keep my head down, and my eyes open. But one thing was certain. The job I'd taken on wasn't going to be as easy as I thought. Chapter 2. The noisy neighbors. My apartment had been strategically chosen directly across from my target's unit. From my window, I had a perfect view of his comings and goings. Every detail I needed to document. He was a creature of habit, predictable in every way. I was here to observe, wait, and eventually act. Simple enough. Right, but focusing on my mission was proving to be a lot harder than I anticipated. Thanks to the lively cast of characters living around me. To my left was Mrs. Choi, an elderly woman with a loud, off-key voice who seemed to have an insatiable love for trot music. The notes blared through the thin walls at all hours, turning what should have been a quiet evening into a cacophony of brass instruments and warbling vocals. At first, I thought it was just a one-time thing, but as the days went on, I realized that Mrs. Choi was an all-hours kind of person. The music didn't stop until well after midnight, and I had to admit, it was starting to get to me. The noise wasn't loud enough to be considered a disturbance, just enough to irritate, just enough to make me lose focus when I needed it most. To my right, a college student named Jin was living his best life. Every weekend without fail, he hosted karaoke nights, the thudding bass from his speakers reverberating through the walls. His friends always showed up with bottles of soju and an eagerness to belt out songs until the early hours of the morning. From what I could gather, Jin was the type who never quite understood the concept of neighbors. His parties were loud enough to make the walls vibrate, and I knew his neighbors weren't thrilled. But he didn't seem to care. Below me, the newlywed couple was another source of constant noise, though, unfortunately, it wasn't all cheerful. Their arguments were frequent and tense, and so loud that I felt like an unwilling third-party observer to their tumultuous relationship. There were nights when their shouting was so heated that I could hear every hurtful word, every accusation, every apology. From the sound of things, the honeymoon phase had ended long before they even moved in. I'd never asked for details, but somehow, I knew more about their relationship than anyone should, details I'd rather forget. And then there was her. Ha-eun. She was my next-door neighbor, and from the moment we met, I knew she would be the most difficult part of my stay here. The kind of woman who naturally drew people in. Effortlessly charming, she was outgoing, and had the uncanny ability to strike up a conversation with anyone, even with someone like me, who made it a point to keep to himself. Within the first week of moving in, she knocked on my door 3 separate times, each visit more insistent than the last. The first time, she showed up with homemade kimchi. The second, it was a broken toaster she didn't need, but she insisted on giving it to me, hoping I might find a use for it. The third time, she brought over a potted plant, her white eyes sparkling with a kindness that I found disarming, even if I didn't want to admit it. Welcome to the building, she chirped during our first encounter, handing me a plate of cookies she had baked that morning, the faint smell of vanilla wafting from the tin. I took the plate with minimal enthusiasm, still trying to wrap my mind around the idea of someone being so friendly when I had made it clear that I preferred solitude. I stared at her for a moment, unsure of what to say. My mind raced for a response, but nothing felt natural. Thanks, I muttered finally, barely making eye contact as I shifted awkwardly on the spot. I hadn't expected to have to deal with people so quickly. But then, she was right there, smiling up at me, waiting for some kind of acknowledgement. I hesitated for just a moment longer before quickly shutting the door as politely as I could manage. The click of the lock a small relief. I didn't need her cookies. I didn't need her kind gestures, and I certainly didn't need her making small talk with me. But that didn't stop her from being persistent. The next day, I received a knock on the door again. This time, she was holding a paper bag, and her wide grin was as infectious as before. I noticed you were struggling to find the right light bulbs the other day, she said with a knowing look, as if I had been wandering aimlessly through the store for hours. I thought I'd pick some up for you, just in case. I felt a pang of frustration. She had seen me leave the apartment and had probably been watching from the hallway, waiting for an opportunity to help. But I didn't want to be rude. Not yet anyway. Thanks, I said flatly, taking the bag with a stiff nod. Of course, she replied brightly, unbothered by my lack of enthusiasm. Let me know if you need anything else. I'm always around. I closed the door, leaning against it for a moment as I tried to gather myself. The last thing I wanted was to make a friend, especially not in a place like this, especially not with a mission hanging over my head. I had to keep my focus, but Ha-eun was persistent, and I was beginning to wonder if her good-natured invasions were more of a challenge than I had anticipated. In a place like this, where the walls were thin, and privacy was non-existent, it wouldn't take much for someone to notice the quiet man who never seemed to engage with anyone. I had to be careful. The noise from Jin's karaoke night began to filter through the walls again, and I could hear the clinking of bottles, and the laughter of his friends. Below, the newlyweds were arguing again, voices rising in volume as the tension between them escalated. Meanwhile, Mrs. Choi's trot music resumed its almost constant playing. I stared at the ceiling, feeling my patience fray with each passing moment. Despite all the distractions, despite the noise, and the constant interruptions, I had a job to do, and I couldn't let anything, or anyone stand in my way. But that didn't mean Ha-eun's smile wasn't beginning to make things a little more complicated than I had anticipated. Chapter 3. The first slip-up. Despite the constant noise and disruptions, I kept to my routine. I had a job to do, and I couldn't afford distractions. My apartment remained sparse and utilitarian, just enough to get by, nothing more. I didn't need luxuries, I didn't need comfort. What I needed was space to think, a place to stay under the radar. The fewer interactions I had with the other tenants, the better. I took to avoiding anything that might attract attention. I always made sure to leave my apartment at odd hours, never too early, never too late, so as not to draw suspicion. My neighbors, if they noticed me at all, saw only the quiet, unassuming guy in Unit 402, the one who kept to himself. No one suspected that behind that facade was a professional killer, one of the best in the underground world, and that my every move was calculated. But as much as I tried to stay invisible, fate has a way of throwing things off course. One fateful night it happened. I had just finished a long day of surveillance, the target's movements were becoming more predictable, and I had finally settled into my apartment. It was late and the building had settled into its usual nighttime rhythm. Mrs. Choi's trot music had faded into silence, Jin's karaoke sessions had finally stopped, and the newlywed couple had fallen into one of their many shouting matches, which eventually tapered off. I figured it was a safe time to clean my knives, a task I usually reserved for late hours when most people were asleep. I pulled out my favorite blade, running a soft cloth along the edge, carefully inspecting it under the dim light of my single lamp. My hands moved with practiced precision, the familiar motions allowing my mind to wander. It was always soothing, this ritual. It was one of the few moments I allowed myself to relax. But tonight, I made one mistake. I forgot just how thin the walls in this building really were. As I sharpened the blade, the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against the stone suddenly cut through the silence. I didn't think much of it at first. I had become so used to the noise of the building over the past few days. But then, a voice drifted through the wall, just on the other side of my door. What was that noise? I froze, knife still in hand, my blood running cold. It was Ha-eun. I stood motionless for a moment, listening as she continued, her voice now tinged with curiosity. Seriously, what is he doing in there? It sounded like metal scraping. She sounded confused, but also, if I was being honest with myself, a little intrigued. My heart rate picked up. I should have been more careful. The walls were paper thin, and in a building like this, any sound, no matter how quiet, could carry. My mind raced, the blood in my ears pounding, and I could feel my grip tightening on the knife. Her voice filtered through the wall again, this time more deliberate, as if she were trying to piece together what was happening next door. Maybe he's sharpening a knife, she said, the words coming out in a half-joking, half-serious tone. Don't be ridiculous. Who sharpens knives at midnight? Another voice, likely a friend of hers, chimed in. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm myself. I had to keep it together. But Ha-eun wasn't letting it go. But, it did sound creepy, she said, her laughter echoing through the walls. I cursed under my breath. I hadn't meant to be heard. But now it was too late. This was exactly why I preferred to keep to myself. This was why I went out of my way to stay under the radar. The more people noticed, the more they would start to wonder, and curiosity had a tendency to spiral out of control. I stood still for a long moment, holding my breath. My mind raced, calculating the potential fallout of this mistake. It wasn't as if Ha-eun could deduce the full extent of what I did, but I had to be careful. I gently set the knife down, my pulse still racing. Part of me wanted to just ignore it, pretend it was nothing, but I knew better. Ha-eun wasn't the type to let something go easily. If she had even the slightest inkling that something was off, she'd keep digging, and that was the last thing I needed. I waited, listening for any sign of movement from the other side of the wall. But when nothing came, I allowed myself a breath. I had a feeling she was just as curious as anyone else, but I couldn't afford to let my guard down. Not now. I picked the knife up again, returning to my task, trying to drown out the faint murmurs of Ha-eun and her friend. The scrape of the blade against the stone was the only sound I allowed myself to focus on, the rhythm grounding me again. But even as I went back to my work, I couldn't shake the feeling that things had shifted. Something was different now. I had made a mistake when I couldn't afford to repeat. And yet, despite the tension in the air, part of me wondered if Ha-eun would keep poking around, trying to solve the mystery of the quiet guy next door. Maybe she'd forget it, maybe not. But either way, I needed to be more careful. The walls were thin, and people were always listening. Chapter 4. The Curious Neighbor. Ha-eun was nothing if not curious. It seemed that the more I withdrew into myself, the more interested she became. She didn't take my coldness as a deterrent, no. If anything, it only seemed to fuel her determination. Every time I thought I'd managed to escape her attention, there she was again, knocking on my door with some new excuse. The first time it happened, I had just gotten back from a long day of surveillance. I was exhausted and looking forward to a quiet evening of solitude, but when I opened the door to find Ha-eun standing there with an oversized smile and a tray of homemade kimchi, I knew there was no escaping her. "Jihun-si, I made too much kimchi. Want some?" she asked brightly, holding up the jar as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "No," I replied flatly, my tone colder than I intended. I didn't want to be rude, but I also didn't want to be involved in any of her social niceties. I had a job to do, and I didn't have time to be anyone's neighbor. She didn't seem offended though. Instead, her smile only widened, and she gave an exaggerated sigh. "Are you sure? I know it's your first week here. You must be tired of instant ramen by now. This kimchi is really good. You could at least try a bite." "I'm fine," I said again, forcing myself to keep the door ajar just enough for politeness. With a final push of her cheerful energy, Ha-eun left the jar on my doorstep and winked. "Just thought I'd check in. Don't be a stranger, okay?" She turned to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't be the last time I saw her. I was right. Over the next few days, she found new excuses to visit, each one more peculiar than the last. The following week, she knocked again, this time with a broken rice cooker she claimed she didn't need anymore. "Jihun-si, do you need a rice cooker? I noticed yours isn't plugged in," she asked innocently, peeking inside as I opened the door. I glanced at the empty counter. My rice cooker was in perfect condition. "I'm good," I muttered, but I knew she wouldn't take no for an answer. "I figured you might need one. Anyway, I've got a spare. No big deal, just thought I'd offer." I shook my head slightly, closing the door with a bit more force than necessary. I didn't want her to think I was ungrateful, but I wasn't here to make friends. The job came first, but it didn't stop there. Another day, as I was coming back from a late-night mission, I found Ha-eun waiting by the stairwell with a large pot in her hands. The aroma of soup hit me before she spoke. "Jihun-si, I made too much soup. Want some?" I couldn't help the sigh that escaped me. "No," I said again, barely glancing at the pot. I didn't want any part of her homemade meals, no matter how kind her gesture might seem. She pouted, but only for a moment. "Are you sure? It's really good. Just one bowl. It's too much for one person." "I don't need it," I answered, trying not to sound impatient. Ha-eun stared at me for a long moment, her bright eyes scanning my face, as if searching for something I wasn't willing to give. After a beat, she shrugged and offered me a soft smile. "Well, okay, Jihun-si, but the offer stands. You're always welcome to stop by." I gritted my teeth, holding my ground. "Thanks, but I'm really not interested." She left without another word, but the weight of her gaze lingered. It felt like she was studying me, trying to figure me out. I couldn't help but wonder, why did she keep pushing? What was it that made her so persistent? It wasn't like I was hard to read. I made sure to be as aloof as possible, barely showing any emotion beyond what was necessary. I kept my distance. I kept my secrets. But Ha-eun seemed convinced there was something more to me. Maybe it was because I didn't fit into her world of casual conversations and open-door policies, or maybe it was because she was genuinely intrigued by my aloofness. Either way, I couldn't shake her off. Then one day, she did something that I hadn't expected. She knocked on my door again, but this time her tone was different. Softer, quieter. "Jihun-si, why do you have so many locks on your door?" The question threw me off guard. I didn't even realize I'd been locking the door so much it was second nature. But now that she was pointing it out, I realized just how odd it must have seemed. Most people didn't have multiple deadbolts. Not in a place like this. I hesitated, then simply said, "Privacy." Her eyebrows furrowed slightly. "You're a private person, huh?" I didn't respond. She wasn't asking for a real answer, but somehow, the question made me feel exposed. Like she was digging into something she didn't quite understand yet. But she wasn't going to let it go. "Well," she said after a long pause, "I respect that. But if you ever need anything, you know where to find me." And with that, she left, as effortlessly as she'd come. Despite my cold responses, Ha-eun didn't seem discouraged. If anything, her visits became more frequent. I tried to keep my walls up, but it felt like she was constantly testing them, trying to find a way in. She was convinced there was more to me than met the eye, and maybe there was. But the last thing I needed was for her to figure it out. Chapter 5. The Target. My target, a mid-level politician tangled up in corruption, lived in Unit 406. My orders were clear: observe and report until further notice. It seemed like an easy job at first. The man was an unremarkable middle-aged bureaucrat with no apparent ties to anything more sinister than the standard political games. He was just another cog in the machine. But the problem was that he was annoyingly ordinary. He rarely left his apartment. Most days he'd spend hours watching TV, only leaving for takeout. The sight of his routine, so repetitive and predictable, almost made the job feel like a waste of time. I'd never had a mission so boring before. Usually, there was a rush of adrenaline, a bit of danger, But not with this guy. He just shuffled around, oblivious to the fact that his life had been infiltrated by someone like me. Still, I kept my focus. Patience was a key part of the job. I had to remain unseen like a shadow, observing from the sidelines until the signal came in. Then, one evening, the monotony was broken. I was watching from my apartment window, like I had countless times before, when I saw him. The politician was leaving his unit, something I hadn't seen in days. His face was tense, his movements hurried as he walked toward his car with a briefcase in hand. My instincts kicked in. I grabbed my gear, slipped out the door, and followed at a safe distance. The night air was cool, and I stayed in the shadows, avoiding any unnecessary attention. I didn't know where he was headed, but this was the opportunity I'd been waiting for. He led me to a rundown office building on the edge of town, meeting with a man I didn't recognize. They exchanged pleasantries before disappearing inside. I found a spot across the street and waited, keeping an eye on the entrance. It wasn't until they re-emerged 2 hours later that I managed to get a glimpse of what was in the briefcase. Nothing that stood out immediately, but I was thorough. I documented everything, sending the intel to my employer with the usual cover message. Subject observed meeting with unknown associate. Further investigation required? I thought for sure that this would be the breakthrough I needed, the moment that would bring the mission to a close. The pieces were falling into place, or so I thought. As I was heading back to the building, I heard her voice, "Ji-hoon-si." I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Ha-eun. She was standing in the parking lot, waving at me as though I was just another neighbor she'd run into. My pulse quickened, but I forced my features into something neutral as I turned to face her. "What are you doing out here?" I asked, my voice sharper than I meant to. I could feel the tension in my shoulders, my mind still racing from the mission. The last thing I needed was an awkward encounter right now. She raised an eyebrow, clearly not intimidated. "I could ask you the same thing," she replied, a teasing edge in her tone. "It's almost midnight." I exhaled through my nose, annoyed at myself for letting her catch me off guard. "None of your business," I snapped, my voice colder than I intended. I wanted to get back to my apartment, to keep things under control. I couldn't afford to be distracted. Her expression faltered, the hint of a frown pulling at her lips. For a second I thought she might press the issue, but instead, she just shrugged, clearly not interested in making things uncomfortable. "Fine," she said, her tone softening. "Good night, Ji-hoon-si." I didn't say anything as she turned to leave. I simply watched her walk away, the clack of her shoes on the pavement echoing in the quiet night. I shouldn't have been bothered by the encounter, but I couldn't shake the feeling that her timing was off. As I made my way back to my apartment, I tried to push the encounter to the back of my mind. There were bigger things at play, and Ha-eun, for all her curiosity, wasn't one of them. At least not yet. But something about the way she'd called out to me, the way she seemed so casual in her curiosity, made me uneasy. Chapter 6. A Complication. The next week, I received my final orders: eliminate the target. The instructions were clear, and the timing couldn't have been better. After days of observation, I had his routine down to a science. He always followed the same pattern, leaving his apartment at exactly 10:45 p.m. every Tuesday to grab takeout from the same restaurant. I'd mapped out every angle, ensuring I could execute the job swiftly, and with no trace left behind. The window was small, but it was perfect. The operation had been meticulously planned, down to the second. Everything was lined up for a clean finish. But, of course, that's when things went wrong. I moved silently through the dimly lit hallway, my footsteps light as I approached Unit 406. I had my gear ready, just a few more minutes, and it would be over. As I reached the door, something made me pause. I heard voices from the other side. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to identify who it was. I could hear the sound of a woman's laughter, Ha-eun's unmistakable voice. She was here. Of all the people, why was she talking to my target right now? Peering through the peephole, I saw her clearly. Ha-eun was standing in the doorway of the target's apartment, a plate of cookies in her hand, looking as bright and cheerful as ever. "What are you doing here?" I heard the target ask, his voice tinged with annoyance. "I live next door," Ha-eun chirped, her usual warmth spilling into her words. "I thought I'd welcome you to the building? It's the neighborly thing to do, right?" I cursed under my breath, feeling my chest tighten. This was not part of the plan. I'd assumed the building's thin walls would work to my advantage, keeping everyone in their own isolated little world. But this was a complication I hadn't anticipated. I took a step back, trying to stay out of sight. My eyes burned as I kept peering through the peephole, my mind racing. Of all the times for Ha-eun to be the friendly neighbor, why now? I'd been preparing for this moment for days, and now everything hung in the balance. I waited. Maybe she'd just drop off the cookies and leave. Maybe this would be a brief interaction, just a passing formality, and she'd go back to her apartment, none the wiser. But no, she didn't leave. I saw the target gesture for her to come in. A quick flick of his hand, an invitation. "Why don't you come in? I'm just about to watch the news," he said, his tone not entirely welcoming but clearly not dismissive either. My heart dropped. This was bad. Ha-eun was not supposed to be involved in this. She wasn't supposed to get close to him, not now. Not when I was so close to completing the job. I stood there in the hallway, seething with frustration, watching them through the peephole. Ha-eun stepped inside, still holding the plate of cookies. The door clicked shut behind her? For a long moment, I did nothing. I stood frozen, my thoughts scattered in 100 different directions. I couldn't move in on the target now, not with Ha-eun there. I didn't want to risk her seeing something she shouldn't. Or worse, getting involved in the chaos of the mission. I waited, hoping she'd leave quickly, but time dragged on. I tried to steady my breathing, forcing myself to think. There was no way I could go in now. I had to wait until she left. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. I kept my eyes on the door, my body tense. Every muscle coiled with impatience. Every creak of the floorboards inside made me jump. I could hear muffled voices through the thin walls, but I couldn't make out the words. I checked the time. It was getting late. The target usually didn't stay up much longer, and neither did Ha-eun. Maybe she'd leave soon? I had to believe that. But as the minutes dragged on, I realized this wasn't a problem that would just disappear. I had no control over Ha-eun. She wasn't part of the plan. I couldn't predict what she might do, or say next. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened again. Ha-eun stepped out, looking a little too comfortable in the target's apartment. She was smiling her usual bright, carefree expression, but there was something else in her eyes. She didn't look as confident as she usually did. Maybe it was the late hour, or maybe the awkwardness of her impromptu visit had caught up with her. She waved at him, a little too casually. "Good night then," she said, her voice light but with an undertone of uncertainty. The target nodded, a strange expression on his face, as if trying to decide whether to be irritated or grateful. "Good night, Ha-eun," he said, his tone flat, before closing the door behind her. Ha-eun stood there for a second, almost as if she was unsure whether to leave or linger. I couldn't risk staying any longer. If she saw me now, if she even suspected what was going on, everything could be ruined. I stepped back into the shadows, ducking around the corner, and holding my breath as she walked past. She didn't seem to notice me. I was just another figure in the darkened hallway. As she disappeared into the stairwell, I allowed myself a moment of frustration. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Ha-eun had just thrown a wrench into my plans. But the mission wasn't over yet. Not yet. Chapter 7. The Unexpected Alliance. The next day, I found her sitting on the stairs outside the building, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring at the ground as if trying to make sense of something. She didn't notice me at first, and I hesitated. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I knew I wasn't prepared for what I was about to hear. "Ha-eun?" I asked cautiously, my voice quieter than I intended. She looked up at me, her eyes tired, dark circles beneath them. There was no trace of her usual cheerfulness, just a heavy sadness that seemed to hang in the air. For a moment, we just stood there, a few feet apart, neither of us saying anything. "Ji-hoon-si," she finally spoke, her voice strained, as though she'd been holding something back for a long time. "Do you think someone could kill a person and hide it?" I felt my blood run cold. A chill ran up my spine as the words hit me. I knew exactly what she was talking about. She'd seen something. My first instinct was to deny it, to tell her it was nothing, that she'd misinterpreted what she'd seen. But I didn't. For reasons I couldn't explain, I found myself asking the only question that mattered. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice tight. She hesitated, wringing her hands together nervously, before speaking again, her words slower this time, like she was testing them on her tongue, before letting them out. I think I saw something last night, in 406. I could feel the tension build in my chest, like a pressure I couldn't escape. The walls felt like they were closing in as I fought to keep my composure. She knew something I couldn't allow her to know. I knew I should ignore it. I should tell her to forget about it, to move on, and not get involved. But instead, I found myself asking a question I hadn't planned to. "What did you see?" Her eyes flickered, uncertainty crossing her face as she looked at me like she wasn't sure whether to trust me or not. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, as if the words didn't come easily. Then, with a sigh, she spoke. "Blood. On his shirt?" He said it was ketchup, but it didn't look right. Her voice wavered, and I could hear the doubt in her tone. She didn't believe it. She knew it wasn't ketchup, but there was something more, something that had made her ask the question in the first place. "Are you sure?" I asked, though I knew it was pointless. Her instincts were sharper than most, and if she had any doubt about what she'd seen, she wouldn't be questioning it. She nodded slowly, her eyes distant, as if replaying the scene in her mind. "I'm sure. It didn't look like ketchup, and the way he acted it was like he was trying too hard to make it seem normal. It wasn't just the blood, it was the way she trailed off, shaking her head, as if the rest was too difficult to put into words. I couldn't afford to let this continue. I had no idea what Ha-eun had stumbled onto, but I couldn't let her investigate further. She was already too close, and her curiosity could get both of us killed if she didn't back off. "Ha-eun," I said, my voice low but firm, "you need to forget what you saw. It's not safe for you to get involved. Trust me, whatever you think you saw, it doesn't matter." She looked up at me, her eyes searching mine, trying to read the truth in my expression. I could see the resistance in her gaze, the urge to push further, to get to the bottom of it. But I wasn't about to let that happen. She opened her mouth, probably to argue, but I held up my hand to stop her. "Please," I said, my voice softening slightly, "just drop it, for your own safety." She bit her lip, her face conflicted. "No, I can't. This is for the safety of the tenants?" "Ji-hoon-si," I know you're strong. Please help me, she asked quietly. Chapter 8. The Partnership. Against my better judgment, I agreed to help Ha-eun investigate. It wasn't out of concern for her safety she'd get herself killed if she poked around alone. And maybe, just maybe, I wanted to protect her. But I couldn't afford to admit that to myself. We'd barely scratched the surface, and already things were getting messier than I'd anticipated. I never should have let her get involved. But now that she had, I couldn't back out. She needed someone to guide her. Someone who knew how to dig for the truth without drawing attention. That's where I came in. Every night, we met in secret, away from prying eyes, poring over the information I'd gathered. Ha-eun, as relentless as ever, had begun asking the right questions. The ones that would uncover the target's deepest secrets. I fed her bits of the truth, little crumbs of intel, enough to keep her on track without revealing too much. Her suspicion about the target's connections had turned into full-blown curiosity, and now, with each discovery, I felt the noose tightening. I kept my identity hidden. To her, I was just Ha-eun, the quiet, aloof neighbor who didn't seem to fit in. She had no idea that the calm facade I showed her was nothing more than a mask. In reality, I was a predator, a professional killer, and I couldn't let her see that side of me. Not yet, maybe not ever. Despite my attempts to distance myself, I couldn't help but notice how her relentless optimism and kindness clashed with my world of violence and deception. Every time she smiled, her eyes full of hope, I felt an unfamiliar tightening in my chest. It was like a part of me, a part I didn't want to acknowledge, was starting to care. She had this uncanny ability to believe in people, to see the good in them. But I wasn't a good person, and I couldn't afford to let her think otherwise. We'd spent the last few days tracking down leads, trying to understand the full extent of the target's corruption. We discovered ties to money laundering, illegal arms deals, and a string of shady real estate transactions. But there was something bigger lurking behind all of it, something I hadn't been able to pinpoint yet. The deeper we dug, the more it felt like we were poking at a hornet's nest, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was only a matter of time before the swarm came after us. One night, as we sat in my apartment, going over some documents I'd managed to steal from the target's trash, Ha-eun leaned back in her chair, rubbing her eyes. "Ji-hoon-si," she sighed. "This is insane. How is he getting away with all of this?" I kept my eyes on the papers, deliberately avoiding her gaze. "People don't notice the small things," I replied, my voice flat. "It's all about the distractions. The public sees one thing, but there's always something happening in the background that they don't question." Ha-eun shook her head. "But he's hurting so many people. I don't get it. Why would someone do all of this just for money and power?" Her innocence, her inability to fully grasp the darkness of the world I lived in, irritated me. I clenched my jaw, my fingers tightening around the edge of the table. She didn't understand. She couldn't. And I hated that I felt the need to protect her from that truth. Because for some people, it's never enough, I said, my voice colder than I intended. Power is an addiction. Once they get a taste of it, they'll do anything to hold on to it. I could see the conflict on her face, the confusion, the frustration. She wanted to believe in the goodness of people, but she was starting to see the cracks in her idealistic view of the world. That was the thing about getting too close to the truth. It didn't just change the way you saw the world. It changed the way you saw everyone in it. Even yourself. "Do you think we'll be able to stop him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air, and I found myself unable to answer right away. I had no doubt that I could eliminate the target, but there were too many moving pieces now. Ha-eun had started something that couldn't easily be undone, and if we weren't careful, we'd both end up as casualties of this game. I ran a hand through my hair and sighed. "I don't know, but we can't stop now. We're too deep." She looked at me, and for a brief moment, I thought she might ask something she shouldn't, but instead, she just nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. Despite everything, she was committed. I could see that now more than ever. The truth was, I wasn't sure where this was going. Maybe I was just dragging her into a world she wasn't ready for. Or maybe, despite all my instincts telling me to stay away, I was starting to care more than I should. There was no room for emotion in this line of work. But Ha-eun had a way of creeping under my skin, of making me question everything I'd ever known. We were walking a dangerous line together, and I wasn't sure if either of us would survive the fall. Chapter 9. The Decision. When it came time to eliminate the target, I faced a dilemma. Ha-eun's suspicions had put her in danger, and the target was starting to suspect her involvement. I knew that if I didn't act, she could become collateral damage. For the first time in my career, I made a choice that wasn't driven by orders. The situation had shifted. It wasn't just about completing a mission anymore. The target wasn't just an assignment. I was beginning to see him as a threat to Ha-eun. A threat to her innocence, her curiosity, her kindness. The qualities I had once found so irritating had now become the very reasons I couldn't let her be hurt. I had always prided myself on being a professional, someone who followed orders without hesitation. Emotions had no place in my work. But Ha-eun, she was different. I had spent so long bearing any trace of humanity within myself that I had almost forgotten what it felt like to care about another person. But with her, it was like a switch had been flipped, and I could no longer ignore the part of me that wanted to protect her, even if it meant breaking my own rules. The decision I had to make was clear. I could eliminate the target, complete the mission, and walk away as the professional killer I had always been, or I could protect Ha-eun, the only person who had ever made me feel human again. But doing that would mean crossing a line. It would mean stepping away from everything I had ever known. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I prepared to take action, but as I stood in front of the target's apartment, my mind was clouded with doubt. I wasn't just here to eliminate a threat. I was here to protect Ha-eun, to keep her safe from a world she didn't understand, from a world I had spent years trying to escape, but one that now threatened to drag her in. I didn't wait for the usual signal. Instead, I walked straight into the building, my footsteps deliberate, each one heavier than the last. When I reached the target's door, I didn't hesitate. The moment the door cracked open, I was inside. I moved quickly, silently, my actions swift and decisive. The target never saw me coming. In the end, I didn't eliminate him as an assassin. I didn't do it for money, or for the order. I did it because I couldn't bear the thought of losing Ha-eun. She had already dragged me into her world of innocence and light, and I was willing to sacrifice everything to keep it that way. Epilogue. The mission complete. I packed my bags, preparing to leave the apartment complex. But as I gathered my things, there was a knock at my door. Ha-eun stood there, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "You're leaving, aren't you?" "I have to," I said simply. "Why?" I hesitated before placing a hand on her shoulder. "Because staying would put you in danger?" "Ji-hoon-si," she whispered. Before she could say more, I stepped past her and disappeared into the night. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, I'd finally found something worth coming back for. Story ends. Thanks for listening. See you again for another silly story.